Buddhai, Namo Dhammai, Namo Sanghai. Jai Bhim. Welcome you all in Navayana Buddhist Sangha short dialogue. Today we will discuss on the idea of Four Noble Truths, specifically the questions raised by Babasaheb Ambedkar in his introduction to the Buddha and his Dhamma. We have with us Venerable Professor Bodhi to reflect on this idea. Before I request him, I will go through the problem raised by Babasaheb in his introduction. He stated, do the four Aryan truths from a part of the original teaching of Buddha? This formula cut at the root of Buddhism. If life is sorrow, death is sorrow, and rebirth is sorrow, then there is an end of everything. Neither religion nor philosophy can help a man to achieve happiness in the world. If there is no escape from sorrow, then what can religion do? What can the Buddha do to reveal a man from such a sorrow which is ever there in birth itself? The four Aryan truths are a great stumbling block in the way of non-Buddhists accepting the gospel of Buddhism. For the four Aryan truths denies hope to man. The four Aryan truths make a gospel of Buddha a gospel of pessimism. Do they form part of the original gospel, or are they a later assertion by the monk? I request Professor Bodhi to reflect on this question.
Thank you, Sujit. This is a very difficult question to engage with, and we need to think a little bit deeply about these processes. Babasaheb came from a deep understanding of Buddhism, contextualized to the Indian reality. So the question that he posed are very, very deep questions. There are a number of ways in which you can understand this. Probably I can only submit my understanding, and I think my understanding is not to the extent in which probably it will suffice in giving an understanding and an explanation to Babasaheb's question. But wanting to attempt to engage, at least from our location and understanding, it is important to think about this in our Sangha. I always remember when I think about this notion of dukkha, I always remember there's one beautiful YouTube video that I used to see of a master from Vietnam. His name is Thich Nhat Hanh, and I used to follow him very closely. So in one of these videos, he talked about the mind, and he gave an example of the ocean. And he says that if you go deep down to the ocean, there is stillness. But if you come at the surface of the ocean, there are a number of waves that are constantly moving. And I used to love that story of the mind. Then on that particular day when I was watching, I remember looking at the comments, and I saw the first comment in response to this video. And the first comment was, why is it that Thich Nhat Hanh always tells the same story all the time? Doesn't he have a new story to tell? So I was just smiling at that comment. And then immediately a second comment followed. Why waste time in this mind? Why waste time in this deep ocean? Why waste time in this suffering? Earn a lot of money, carry a bag, carry a suitcase, and travel across the world. There's so many things to experience in this world, so many cultures to meet, so many lifestyles to be in. I mean, why do you have to waste time in this mind and suffering and so on and so forth? And then when I scrolled down, I saw the third comment. And the third comment was simple. It simply wrote, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Now, all of us who are Buddhists, we know what sadhu means. It simply means well said, beautifully said, harmoniously said, to the point, properly stated, properly responded. So this is exactly what we mean by sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So when I was thinking about this, you see, the first thing that came to my mind is that how people perceive some of the ideas in Buddhism, this notion of suffering and dukkha in Buddhism, very differently. Not all of us experience the same intensity of suffering, nor the same dimensions of suffering, or the same type of suffering. You cannot generalize suffering. You can generalize suffering in terms of that people do experience a layer of life in which pain and suffering is fundamental, but not all of us experience the same type of suffering. What suffering you will experience is not suffering what I will experience. So we must be careful to respond to this question because each of us have very different experiences of these processes. Now, in a Buddhist perspective, in response to Baba Sahib's location of this as a problem, the problematization of this, it is an understanding in Buddhism that when you use the word dukkha, you are referring to a particular process. And the process is simple, contained in 3 words: anicca, anatta, and dukkha. Anicca is that everything in this world is in a state of impermanence, rising and passing away, and rising and passing away. In this state of anicca, where everything is moving, arises what you call the unsatisfactoriness. People who know the Patiksha Samopad will know that there is something called Vedana, the pleasant and the unpleasant feelings. It is this that is the root cause of unsatisfactoriness. In trying to resolve this, in trying to engage with this unsatisfactoriness, we create what is called an I, a construct of a self, a personality, an ego. So it is from these processes of unsatisfactoriness we create this concept of an I, socially constructed, produced from the experience of Vedana and Tanha. And we hope that this I will be able to understand this unsatisfactoriness. Unfortunately, what the Buddha said was this I is always stuck either in the past or in the future. It cannot live the present. And because it cannot live in the present, it begins to suffer. It goes through lamentation and grief and stress and distress and sorrow and pain. And there it lives in that particular world. So this mind is in a state of distress, in a state of pain, a state of sorrow, a state of lamentation and grief. So in the Buddhist perspective, when we are talking about dukkha, we are referring to dukkha as part of a process in which people experience this. Now, what is important is that the Buddha refers to these as imbalances or not being in harmony with self. So Sakyamuni himself, as a teacher, once he had had deep insights into processes of this kind from his own engagement through Satipatthana, for instance, once he had insight on how these things come to be, this state of suffering, the origin of that suffering, the cause of that suffering, the possibilities of the cessation of suffering, and also the path to the freedom in suffering, it became clear to him how exactly all of this great framework of suffering basically operates. So in the light of this, he realized that in the context that he was in, he realized that this individual suffering is very, very real. It is not that people are imagining suffering. It is very real. But people suffer many types of suffering. Individual suffering is only one of the sufferings. And generally, individual suffering stems from the crisis of mind. People who have experienced depression and extreme severe depression, they will know what it means to have a crisis of mind. When you cannot live with your mind anymore. When your mind has taken over your life. When you begin to experience these processes. And every moment in life is just being cautious of not to cross this line that will between sanity and insanity. So there is a lot of experiences that people have at the individual level. But Sakyamuni saw not only individual, he saw social suffering in the context he was living in. Extreme discrimination, poverty. He saw structural suffering, in terms of what you would understand as extreme forms of oppression by one group on the other. He saw historical suffering, the inferiorization of one group by another group, and the inferiorization to such an extent that people begin to even suffer different kinds of what you might even call discursive suffering. And the destruction of so-called life itself has taken place. So Sakyamuni was born in a context in which suffering was not to be reduced only to the individual. He was operating in a context where there was social suffering, there was structural suffering, there was historical suffering, there is even discursive suffering, if you want to use that word. So having observed all of these types of suffering, Sakyamuni's message was clear. You can come out of all of this suffering. And he spent 40 years of his life traveling around, teaching people the way to come out of this suffering. So for Baba Saheb, it becomes very important to capture this message of Sakyamuni. Because for Baba Saheb, Sakyamuni's real central message to all of us is that you can be free from this suffering. And that is contained in a word called Nibanna. The Buddha's message is a message about Nibanna and happiness. We cannot reduce the Buddha's message to dukkha and suffering. So for Buddha and for Baba Saheb, as he began to read the Buddha, it was clear that Nibanna is the core of the Buddha's teaching. And this is exactly what we must teach our people. The Buddha did not come to eulogize suffering, but to tell you how to come out of it and to experience Nibanna. And at the core of Nibanna, Baba Saheb was very clear that there is a concept called karma. And for Baba Saheb, karma means causation, the law of cause and effect. And he made a beautiful argument by saying that this law of cause and effect is the reason why morality is possible. Now, that's another video we will do later. But at this point in time, it is just to stick to the idea of how Baba Saheb saw karma as a law of causation, also the possibilities of morality to be central to the Buddha's message of freedom and the attainment of Nibbana. Now, for Baba Saheb, at least in my understanding, he saw in Buddha, he saw in the teachings of the Buddha the philosophy of the freedom of mind, the philosophy of social emancipation, a philosophy that brings morality as central rather than ideas of God and he was very wary of these superstitious beliefs. Baba Saheb, he saw in the Buddha someone who was against superstition, against supernatural beliefs. He saw Buddha as a person who confronted the idea of God and even negated that there is nothing called a God. He was against this idea of a belief between the union between you, the individual, and God. The Buddha was against the notion of soul, against the notion of sacrifice, against the notion of speculation. The Buddha was one who challenged the infallibility of the words of God contained in a text. So in the Buddha, Baba Saheb saw all of these processes, which was very fundamental to him. So, and being aware, and to me personally, when I read Baba Saheb was aware about how this notion of dukkha and suffering has been used by the oppressor, the oppressed people. Like, for instance, he was aware about what happened in Western Europe. If you look at Western Europe, the whole theory of feudalism and the structure of feudalism was kept intact for 800 years, simply because the serfs accepted that the greater the suffering, the closer I am to God. So suffering is good. And Baba Saheb knew that this notion of suffering has been used for oppressing. While the dominant has a very luxurious life, they sold the idea of suffering to the serf and to the oppressed, and they believe it. And once they believe it, they were stuck for 800 years. In our own context, we have the same kind of a theory. Here in this context, suffering is normal. Occupational suffering is normal. That if you know your role, you play your role, you are faithful to your occupational role, then probably in the next life you will go into a higher occupational status. So Baba Saheb was very clear that this suffering is a very dangerous concept if it is produced, understood individually, but if it's produced as a social and political philosophy, it is the way to oppress people. So, aware of all of this, he was a little bit restrained to say that there is something here in which people have begun to produce Buddhism as a theory of suffering, as a philosophy of suffering, rather than as a philosophy of happiness, and a philosophy of freedom of mind, philosophy of social emancipation. So, these points are important. And one more thing that I felt Baba Saheb always kind of was very, very clear about, based on his extensive reading, was that Baba Saheb always stressed on one point. His point was, do not decontextualize the teachings of Sakyamuni. Okay? Sakyamuni had deep insights, not about his own life, not about reality, about the totality of being itself. But when he began to teach to the people, he responded to the concrete social and political conditions, the concrete individual condition of people. That is why there's this beautiful saying in Buddhism. Someone asked one master, what is the teachings of Sakyamuni? What is Buddhism? The master responded, Buddhism is nothing but an appropriate statement. So the Buddha appropriately responds not only to the individual suffering, but to social, political, existential, structural suffering, and so on and so forth. So for Baba Sahib, he saw the teachings of the Buddha rooted in the context. For Baba Sahib, taking the Buddha's teaching out of its context is a problem. For him, every theory is born in a context and every theorist has an agenda. The Buddha did not suddenly come out with certain teachings that make no meaning and no relevance to the people at all. So in that particular context, Baba Sahib warns us, do not take the teachings of the Buddha outside of context. He was responding to a context. And it is this kind of a message that Baba Sahib wants to give to us. So for him, anything that decontextualizes, that engages with Buddha's teaching as though it is out of a context, up there somewhere in an esoteric manner that has nothing to do with the lives of people in his particular context, in his particular historical juncture, in his particular time, was a very problematic proposition to make. So in that particular sense, he was very clear. One is, do not ennoble this idea of suffering, because the Buddha actually did not do that. It is only the later people who came, and then, when they began to reduce it to individual engagement, individual suffering, then they started talking about suffering in that sense. So it was wrong in many ways, at least from his point of view, to think otherwise. So for him, he felt that there is a poverty in a spiritual practice, poverty in a path, poverty in a Buddhism that is devoid of social and political messages. There's a poverty in a Buddhism that is devoid of politics. We have to live a life, we have to eat, we have to have a house, we have social relationships. If Buddhism doesn't help us to understand these from a location of morality, then how do we live in this world? So these were the questions that came to Baba Sahib, And this he saw in the message of the Buddha himself. For 40 years, he went around teaching people about what emancipation was. And if you look at the suttas, emancipation is not only of the individual. He was talking about social emancipation, how to behave properly, how to engage with reality, how to engage as a moral being, and so on and so forth. So for me, when Baba Sahib problematized this in his introduction, it is clear that it is not that Baba Sahib was against the notion of the dukkha, but he says don't ennoble the dukkha, because the true message of Sakyamuni, the Buddha, the enlightened one, is that it is possible in this one life to free your mind, to experience social emancipation, to experience your total being as you are, and to have a taste of happiness, the taste of Nibanna. So to me, this is the real message when Baba Sahib actually puts that point. There are many ways of interpreting, but probably from my side, this is exactly my humble submission at this point in time, just to kind of give a new way of understanding these processes. Thank you, Suri.
Yes. I said sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Well said, beautifully said. Thank you very much, sir. We will come with another video, another short dialogue in this series. Thank you, sir.